Welcome, everyone. Glad to see you all. My name is Sheila Bravo, and I'm with Dana, the Delaware Alliance for Nonprofit Advancement. We're really glad that you can join us today. I'm really thrilled to have Dr. Devona Williams, as well as Erika Broadwater, who will be speaking on a topic today around having a just workplace. Before we Dr. Devona and Erika begin, I'd like to just give a little introduction to who they are and their background. And we'll start with Dr. Devona Williams, who is president and CEO of Goins Williams Associates. And she has contributed her talents to helping over, tons of people across many different types of organizations to increase their performance and effectiveness. And she is also a frequent speaker in business, diversity, leadership, and motivation. And she's also president of the board of trustees at Delaware State University. So Dr. Devona wears many, many different hats. We also have with us today Erika Broadwater, and she's president of the National Association of African Americans in Human Resources, Employer Attractiveness and Talent Acquisition Directors, HR Center of Excellence. And she has over 26 years of experience in human resources, progressively building her career as a strategic talent and human capital leader. So I'm really thrilled that both of them are here today. And I will stop my conversation so that I can leave the rest of the time for them to speak. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Williams.
All right. Thank you, Sheila. It is wonderful to be here, and good morning to everyone. I'm going to pull up our shared screen, and give me just a moment to do that. Okay, well, thank you again. It is our pleasure to be here this morning. So welcome everyone, and Erika, say hello to everyone again.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. We are so pleased to be able to present this workshop today, creating a more just workplace for the nonprofit human resource management area. And this is something that's so important to human resources. And Erika and I have known each other now for quite a few years. We came together initially with her work with NAAA HR and also the Diversity Coalition, the Delaware Diversity Coalition. And today's workshop for nonprofit human resources management addresses the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace from perspectives of talent management and organizational performance management. And so Erika will be addressing the HR issues, the talent management issues, and I will be focusing on organizational performance. Erika.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Devona. And again, welcome everyone to this very important topic and call. This workshop today is a passion of all of ours, I think, or we wouldn't be on this call right now. So again, thank you for your participation. You know, in the HR function in nonprofit management, it can play a critical role as leaders in setting the tone for diversity and inclusion and increase equity in the workplace. You know, keep in mind that many nonprofit organizations have small or even non-existent HR departments. This is an area that executive directors, CEOs, perhaps even your board of directors should pay attention to. Again, the critical importance of this conversation is not the in the moment and for the now, which you'll hear both Dr. Devona and I talk about, but it's something that needs to continue to be addressed, evolve, and be recognized for what it is. As we go through today's presentation, you know, certainly we want to hear from you. So we're going to be utilizing the chat room as much as possible. If you all can, keep your microphones on mute, but certainly if there's something burning and you have a question that you need us to stop and pause, you know, certainly do so. But for the most part, because this is recorded, we ask that you put all your comments and thoughts in the chat room, and your microphone's on mute. Dr. Devona.
Okay, thank you. And so how did we get to where we are today? We thought it would be important for us to lay the groundwork, the context of how we find ourselves today. So I don't have to tell you all that we're living in unparalleled times. And we're dealing with multiple crises that are all converging together at one time. So we have a pandemic, we have economic problems, we have social unrest, we have health disparities, and on top of that, we've just gone through this presidential election. I don't want to laugh, but we're still dealing with that. And so this is where we are. We're experiencing this unprecedented time. And there are many other issues that are swirling around this whole topic of a just workplace, the theme of our workshop. We've got immigration issues, we have census issues, voting rights issues, gender inequities, and the rising wealth gap. And the image that you see here, this is the March on Washington that followed the murder of George Floyd. And it was just such it's a historic image. We've never really seen anything like it, even greater than the March on Washington back with Dr. Martin Luther King back in the 60s. And when you look at this image, it really shows the amount of energy that came and created a renewed spotlight on social justice and racial equity. With all of us witnessing a shared event, the murder of George Floyd in public, on televised, nationally, globally, it had everyone locked in that moment, and people witnessing an experience that people who are of African-American background or Black know this is a reality that they've lived and their families have lived for many years, that now the world has witnessed. Mm-hmm. And it's a system that has been systemically biased against Blacks and African Americans. We know the roots are based on slavery. And we also know that it has exposed many other systemic biases that are part of our overall system in the United States, but in other countries around the world as well. Erika.
Yeah, so the image that you're seeing that Dr. Devona is showing, the world is watching us. So while this is a very small representation of, the disparity and the need for many of us to take action, even by the way of the March on Washington, whether back in the 60s all the way until even this year, the world is watching. And so, Dr. Devona and I, we've been at this work for a long time, and we've seen the impact of the work. Now with the emphasis on social justice, as it evolved from civil rights to affirmative action by way of valuing people, then to diversity and inclusion, and now it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, otherwise known as DEI. It's now taking on the feel of a movement acknowledging the fundamental issues of social justice and the systemic racism that has been unspoken for far too long. Whereas, it's an acknowledgement for some that has built this nation and the legacy of slavery, while, for others, it's a form of reckoning. Not all share the same views. And so we can all look at this image and see something different, and it means something different to each of us. But, one of the examples is the executive order just recently released by the current president, banning federal funding for certain kinds of diversity training. In his order, he makes it easy to hire and fire civil servants that work on policies, stripping some protection from career employees before a potential change in the administration. And unfortunately, this is what the world is seeing of us today. And it's time, and it's been time for us to make certain changes. Dr. Devona?
Yes, and so as some people see this as an opportunity for unity, many others see it as an opportunity to be more fearful, because the fear is rooted in the fact that, yeah, now we probably do really need to change. We've talked about change before, but perhaps now we really need to change. And I think that is so much of where the fear is coming from. So let's talk about what our topics are today in our workshop. We're going to cover quite a few things that, and Erika and I will go back and forth, and as we are already starting to do. We want the session to be interactive, so as Erika mentioned, please respond your answers or questions or thoughts in the chat room, and we'll be checking that. We have a couple of polls we wanted to use, but we will not be using the polling questions, but we'll just ask those questions and ask you to respond accordingly. So the first thing we want to do is to discuss how organizational culture influences all diverse talent acquisition, from acquiring or recruiting to advancement, and also it is an element of retention. And then we want to explore practical tips for organizations to limit bias in the recruitment, selection, as well as professional development and advancement in all aspects of HR. And then we're going to move in discussing how to develop human resources policies on diversity, equity, and inclusion that impact workplace culture and employee behavior. And lastly, we want to leave you with 5 HR strategies to transition into a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. And when we say transition, it's not a point in time. We ultimately want to achieve transformation, but transition is moving toward that. Today's HR professionals must be authentic in their leadership on this issue. Many smaller nonprofits do not have HR departments, and so it's up to the chief executive officer or the board chair or others to really look at these new requirements in the workplace and hold people accountable for it. And this is the reality today. All leaders must be accountable for having and maintaining a just workplace. So we're going to move on to our first poll. Erika.
Yes, so as we mentioned, we would like to utilize the chat room since we are not able to use the polling feature on today's Zoom. So I'm going to ask the first question to just kind of gauge where you are with respect to your organization by asking a couple of questions. So if you will respond in the chat room, how many of you have had a conversation at your workplace about diversity, equity, and inclusion? If you'll write your response in the chat room, this way Dr. Devona and I can respond to that. I see Sheila has almost every day, Terrence. Jamie, of course.
Yeah, we have.
Michelle,
Yes.
Nancy.
Yes.
That's great. We have this regularly at the staff and board meetings. Great, Michelle. Yes, the CAC of Delaware has. Okay, Nicole. So it sounds like, this is conversation that's being had, which is relevant because, first is the acknowledgement and awareness. And as Dr. Devona said, then the accountability. All right, so Jay says currently practicing in a cohort with Team Sharp to improve proximity and inclusion. Wow, proximity, great.
There's one from Bonnie, not a specific conversation, being new to the organization. Time of onboarding, we've read policies.
Okay. And sometimes those policies are heard and it goes right over people's heads. If you don't truly understand what those policies are, you could be still left in the dark. So, Bonnie, for you and anybody else who hasn't responded in the chat that doesn't have these conversations regularly, sometimes, and we talk about this quite a bit, are you able to bring your whole self to the workplace? And if you're not able to have those conversations, why not? So does your workplace have policies on diversity and inclusion? And if they do you actually understand those policies? Can you articulate them to your colleagues, to your employees, or even Michelle at a board meeting?
And we can ask people to raise their hands too. If you'd like to use the raise hand feature under, you'll see it along the bottom there on your taskbar, reactions. Or you can also respond in the chat.
And if you're not sure if your workplace has policy on diversity and inclusion, that's fine as well.
So what I find interesting about this discussion is that so many people already have at least had the conversation at their workplace. So my question would be, how do we get people around the table who haven't had that conversation? Those are the people that we really want to be able to reach out to. That's the way that we can make this change happen. Mm-hmm. So I see that we have a few people that say, oh, we have a statement, but I wouldn't say we have a policy regarding hiring and development processes. Yes, we have policies, we do.
And Catherine, that's not uncommon. A lot of companies do have just statements, and what's the meat behind the statement, you know, and that's the importance of it all.
Okay.
All right.
So a number of different responses there. So a range of responses. Let's move on then and talk about just some definitions so that we can level set. If we can advance the slide. Sometimes they get frozen.
Yeah, you may need to click on the actual slide if you were in the chat room. Yeah, click on the slide and then advance it.
There we go. Okay. So thank you. With equity first, let's have a definition of equity. It's a little different than equality. And in my business, I run across this conversation about fairness in the workplace quite often. But equity in the workplace means that everyone receives fair treatment. There's transparency to cause and effect, and everyone knows what to expect in terms of consequences and rewards. When equity exists, people have equal access to opportunities. And that's really the key. It sets up an advantageous environment for both the employees and the employer. So the perception of fairness means that everyone has equal opportunity to move, to advance, to have opportunities throughout the organization. An equitable workplace or an equity workplace is one that is a just workplace. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about workplace culture because this is really at the heart of everything that we do when we're trying to develop a just workplace. Workplace culture, what is it? It starts with a culture that everyone knows you have a culture in a workplace. We just don't always state what it is. And so we have implicit workplace norms, and these are behaviors that are expected when you work in this particular environment to show or to display. But for new employees, it's a challenge because it often takes anywhere between 12 to 18 months to really learn what those implicit rules are, workplace norms are for a workplace culture. So every place has a culture. We don't always know what they are. They are the shared values that employees will share. Delaware, you can think of DuPont Corporation, for example, the culture, both implicit and explicit, implicit understood, explicit stated, was safety. When you think about the former MBNA, what was the culture that everybody related to at MBNA? You all remember? The customer comes first. And people remember the green awnings from MBNA. So there are implicit forms of culture and explicit. When someone says that you are a good fit in an organization, they mean that you align with the cultural values. Expected behaviors that are explicit are usually the workplace value statements. But just because you state that you have a value doesn't mean that they're actually happening or occurring in the workplace. And so you'll see a lot of organizations, sometimes it's a one-word value statement, or it's a statement and then an explanation or the workplace norm or behavior that is expected to go along with that value. I spend a lot of time working with organizations on developing shared values and helping people actually process them. And quite often, employees will say that they didn't realize that these were the values, or that people are not really emulating the values that they say they have. And so we know that values shape culture. And within organizations, it's what attracts employees, and it attracts clients or customers to an organization, but it's also the number one reason that people will leave. If the values are not in alignment with people who work there, then that's an area of disconnect. Many organizations will dance around, I'll call it dancing around the whole value statement when it comes to diversity. Sometimes they'll say respect or diversity. We value diversity. Well, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so now we have to take a look at what we really want to say and mean when it comes to values that reinforce a just workplace. Erika?
Yeah, and so when you think about values, you also have to think about the EVP, right? The employee value proposition. And we're living in, unprecedented times where people are working remote, unfortunately, and we'll probably see this going on even into next year. So, how do we address workplace culture when people are working remotely? And, remote work brings on its own challenges. Recent studies show the disproportionate effects to women, in particular, working remote. Do we have the empathy for coworkers, subordinates, or for their unique situations? So an example, and this is, not throwing any shade on men, with all due respect to men, but the woman, when you are used to going into the office and sending your children off to school, you come home and, the proper things to do, like, preparing meals for the family for dinner and the whole list of things goes on. Well, the woman really never has an opportunity to sit down and even value themselves, much less value the work environment that now they're being forced into, which is still maintaining a normal work-life balance, now educating their children from home, and still having to take care of the needs of the home. So it's disproportionate in a way that, do they feel valued? And are we doing anything to reinforce and encourage that value? So working remotely, we also have to think about that cultural aspect to our remote workforce.
Absolutely. And we know that there are some disproportionate impacts that this current transformation is having. And it's another area of thought in terms of relooking at the values that are currently in place. So let's talk about the cultural challenges. And there are many challenges. First, when it comes to onboarding new employees, this provides the first challenge. How do you explain organizational culture to a new employee? It's really hard to explain, right? What's it like to work here? And usually when you start a new job, you go around and you talk to people. What's it really like to work here, right? You can look at the value statements, but you say, what's it really like to work here? And then so you look at and you seek out people that are oftentimes like yourself or fit categories that you might fall into, and then you ask them. And that's how you give a check of what it's like. So when you're onboarding a new employee, how do you communicate what the value is? And how are those organizational behaviors actually being shown in the workplace? New employees will observe the behaviors and they will make their own determination. So you could tell them this is what we value, but new employees will look around and they will ask those questions, and then they will come to their own conclusion what the values really are. Cultures are constantly changing. And what Erika just shared with us is this total big transformation that we are going through now in terms of moving into a remote transformation. It's not just transition, it's a transformation. And so we have cultural shifts, cultural evolutions, and that's also happening internally as well as externally. So it's very dynamic right now, and it will impact us into the future. So that's something to think about. The greatest challenge in all of this is ensuring that culture includes and does not exclude. There are issues of equity, fairness, and they are at the forefront and are the expectations of employees. Employees are looking for empathy for their situations today, and especially younger employees. And we know we have to continue to engage younger employees, and they're different than some of the older employees because they've grown up with diversity and inclusion. In 2020, I've already conducted 3 employee investigations on social justice issues in the workplace. And most of them stem around this issue of fairness in the workplace and of adherence to guidelines. And in one case, a general manager was not in touch at all. He had never even read his own corporate policy on diversity and inclusion. So the policy was being violated by many of the employees. And it came back to haunt him in this case. So leaders have an obligation not just to walk the talk, but also to be in touch with their policies. And employees also need to know what they are. They have an obligation to be in touch with it. And as you can see, leaders must be accountable for adhering to those values. So I'm going to move on to another definition, and this is a definition of inclusion. We talk so much about inclusion, we thought it would be helpful just for us to take a look again at this definition of inclusion. So inclusion, it actually stemmed out of special education movement to include children with disabilities. And inclusion is actually the act of making a person or a thing a part of a group or collection. It really has to do with this whole practice of involvement and respect, but for people to have a sense of belonging. I belong here. I fit here. I'm a part of this organization. I'm not excluded based on all that I bring to this organization. And we know that there's a great tie between inclusion and productivity. And this is actually the business case. Back in the day when we were first doing diversity training, we always had to go out and make the case to bring people in, to make the case for why is diversity important. We talked about this whole notion of productivity. So we know that when people are included, that their richness of their backgrounds and what they bring to the table are all part of it. Erika.
Yes, and as we even think about workplace culture, policies, and the definition of inclusion, there's another side of this coin, and that is you as an employer building a diverse workplace. So the other side of this coin is as you're recruiting, hiring, and retaining employees, you also have to think about, have you brought someone in that fits the model of the culture of your organization? A true example of that, of which I was on a legal call yesterday, in fact, just in perfect timing, we had a very strong candidate interviewing for an executive position. And this young lady said, is the hiring manager a male or female? And she clearly said in the interview, she does not want to work for a female because women are, difficult to work with. They're opinionated, and she did not want to work for a woman. And we had to make a conscious decision. How do we ethically and legally reject her? Because it could come back that she feels that she's not being hired out of discrimination. But in fact, she was turning us down due to discrimination. And so if we proceed with her, are we allowing her toxic thoughts and attitudes into a culture that we just can't see fitting into our organization? So that's a challenge that we also have to be very careful, because that's walking a very thin line. While we do want to practice inclusivity, we also have to remember the culture of our organization. Dr. Devona?
Yes, and that goes back to this whole issue of alignment. So it goes two ways, right? It's employees having to fit with an organization and vice versa, an organization having to fit with the employee. And inclusiveness has so much to do with attitude, but also you have red flags that go off, and that's one of them, right? Someone says, I can't work with this type of group, or I can't work with this type of person, and that's probably not a good fit for a just organization.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about defining and monitoring culture. Defining cultural values is an important step to take. So it cannot be sidestepped or overlooked. And I have found so often that organizations that, they want to bring people together to move forward on other major issues, if they haven't spent time on the cultural values and really defining them and working through them, it's hard to move forward. And to be progressive, we really do have to define those cultural values. And so the question is, if your organization, or there's several questions, if your organization has stated values, when is the last time your team discussed them? You can put some of your responses in the chat room if you'd like. Do you know what they are? If you have stated values, do you know what they are? Do you think they need to be updated? Do you think now is the time to look at your cultural values to determine if you need to have a statement on diversity, equity, inclusion? Is that a part of your cultural values? With the recent events we've talked about, now's the time to dust those values off and take a fresh look of them, and not just looking at them, but then having a discussion about what do these values mean. If we last developed values statements 10 years ago, don't you think it's time for us to re-examine them in light of where we are today? Do they work with your current workforce? Do they work with the volunteers that might work with your organization? Do they work with the clients or the people that you serve? Do they work with everyone, all of your stakeholders? So these are the questions that you would want to ask. Remember that our culture is ever changing, and leaders must be able to assess and monitor the culture to ensure that it's inclusive. And I'll just end this segment by saying, who's missing from the table? Who's missing from the table as you go through your cultural reevaluation or relook at all of this? Who's missing from the table? Have you brought in some of the people that you serve to take a look at your values or to talk through the value statements? Erika.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the chat room, Dr. Devona. Michelle Taylor is saying, at our staff meetings, we incorporate in every staff and board meeting, trying to get people to understand why they mean what they mean as we, I think she's saying as we live them, either good or bad. And that's, really important. And I would also, Michelle, challenge your board and your staff why it matters to them even personally. So while, you have to have a level of understanding, why does that understanding matter to them? Because you can understand something, but it really has no effect on you personally. So, and we're not going to, talk a lot of politics, but even if we talk about our organizations, culture matters in our organization. But why does it matter to me personally? What do I get out of it? Because as Dr. Devona mentioned before, we can talk about retention, and we can talk about sustainability with our workforce, but it has to mean something to them as well. And, depending on the type of business or organization, company culture can evolve due to the adoption of new technologies, changing of demographics or workplace norms, competition from within the industry, and several other factors that are in play. But business cultures are extremely varied, and a wide range of continued shifting and changing in our workplace environments. We're seeing and living through that right now. HR departments can play a vital role in helping companies and organizations to come up with policies and norms that can define the company culture, particularly in areas where it's not defined, it's not understood, and it's not even there. On one level, a healthy and stimulating company culture can drastically affect employees' performance, output, and I would even say retention. But are we asking the right questions? So Michelle, that's why I put that challenge out there. Are we asking the right questions? Lynn, even for your comment, do we know what we want our organizational culture to look like? And can we actually create that real inclusive environment? Not just at the surface, not just a statement, not just creating that wonderful banner ad, but actually creating a healthy work environment with the essential tools to not only attract the right talent, but retain the best talent in our organizations. So what are some of the questions that come to your mind? And you can write in the chat room. What are some of the questions that come to your mind that would help your organization get to where you need to be in building an inclusive work environment?
Well, Erika, I'm still seeing some other comments from others about having to have this conversation, seeing that there is a need to actually have the conversation and go back and re-examine the value statements. I'm not seeing any comments yet on the questions. I know we asked a lot of questions in this part of the discussion.
I like Terrence's statement also. We continue to connect our values to inclusive behaviors, which can also be demonstrated, right? So connecting those dots, are vitally important when you're walking the walk and talking the talk.
Okay. So I think we asked a lot of questions on this one, Erika, so we can go back and relook at those questions. But defining and monitoring culture is probably one of the most important things that should be done when it comes to creating a just workplace and making sure that there's a shared value system across the organization.
Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to move us to our next slide. And Erika.
Yes, indeed. So tips for limiting biases or mitigating biases first comes with recognizing unconscious bias through all aspects within the HR function. I talked about before, acknowledging and that awareness. So it is recognizing that unconscious bias does exist. The recruiting, selection, retention, development, and advancement process. They are all also very important in limiting some of the biases, even the way we separate with our employees. And a more inclusive and equitable workplace is ultimately the goal. Here we see that unconscious bias can make workplaces uncomfortable for women and minorities, but it can also block them from getting their foot in the door or advancing. And I don't want to always, speak on behalf of women and minorities, but it could also be a roadblock for many people. There are some biases that we have even within our own social groups or cultural groups that could actually define that unconscious bias. One of which, we could see like people. So when I think about Dr. Devona and myself, do I choose to lean to hiring, promoting, and advancing Dr. Devona over, let's say, Terrence? Terrence, not to pick on you, but he's an African-American, Devona's an African-American. So even within our own culture, we find ways unconsciously to have biases for or against people. So hiring is one of the most common practices of unconscious bias, but there's also those within the organization that could lead to unfair representation. Some of the best practices is really to listen to the experience of those who may be marginalized in your office or in your workplace, whether it's due to age, gender, race, disability, or economic status, or even their social status. Do they feel respected? Do they feel heard? Do they even feel that they're being acknowledged in the workplace? Have you had a stay interview with some of your employees? Do you recognize their needs? What is it that they need to get to the right place in their workplace? Some of the tips on recruiting and retaining when it comes to mitigating unconscious bias is limiting and your thoughts of, I should really say it this way, recognizing when you have those thoughts. As soon as you feel that it's uncomfortable putting yourself in that person's seat, then you know that there's a problem. But when you start recognizing that you have demonstrated, whether it's in the hiring and recruiting or it's in the retention and advancement, when you start recognizing that you have demonstrated those unconscious biases, that's where you have the rude awakening within yourself. And you have the opportunity to change and be that dynamic force that improves or limits those unconscious biases. Devona?
Erika, yes, we have a question or statement from Sheila, and she says, what is the right balance of respecting individual perspectives and biases while also identifying biases that are not acceptable?
I think the latter comes first. It's unacceptable. No matter what, it's completely unacceptable. Again, as I say, put yourself in that person's shoes. How would you want to be treated? No matter what your demographic background is, no matter what your upbringing is, would you want to be in that person's shoes as you are, demonstrating bias towards them? So I think the latter comes first, and the balance will find its way to really tip the scale and change the dynamic of not only your language and the way you communicate to others and the way you treat others, but it also balances things in the workplace, because you're not going to tolerate unconscious bias. You're not going to tolerate any kind of bias. You're not going to tolerate any kind of discrimination, because now you know what it feels like to be overlooked. Now you know what it feels like to be undermined or discriminated against. And so when you put yourself in that person's seat, or you feel and recognize that you just said or did something that just didn't line up with your company's cultural values, respect, diversity, inclusion, equity, when you recognize that, that's where you start making that balance work.
Yeah, and I think that's why having the dialogue and having discussions are so important, because at those times, then we can talk about what are some examples, what are the things that are the don'ts, what are things we shouldn't say, we can't say, we mustn't say. And people can reveal those kinds of things that make them feel uncomfortable. And then that group sharing is what helps people learn. Mm-hmm. I'm going to move us to our next slide. And Erika.
Mm-hmm. So I want to give you some examples of understanding unconscious bias. So what is unconscious bias, and how do we recognize it within ourselves? Devona, you can keep clicking through. It is a prejudice, quite frankly, and without even a whole lot of explanation behind it. It's a prejudice in favor or against one thing, a person, or a group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. So again, I'll even use the example of me advancing Devona or promoting her or hiring her over Terrence. We are within the same ethnic group, but she happens to be a woman. I happen to love the color red, and she's wearing red today, and so it could be in favor of Devona, but it's totally negative and lacks favor for Terrence. A cause to feel or show inclination or prejudice for or against someone or something. Again, there's that word prejudice. Prejudice and discrimination are two very distinct words, but they work hand in hand, and they're never for the good. A preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. So here's the fact of it all. It's not based on any real evidence. It is what you feel. And not to undermine what you feel, because you may feel justified in that prejudice or in that discrimination, but you have to ask yourself why. Why would you choose Devona over Terrence if clearly their backgrounds are exactly the same? What is it about Devona that stands out to you? And then an act of harm or injury that results or may result from some action or judgment. That is unconscious bias. Now, why do I use that last example? Harm may not be physical harm. It could be emotional harm. It could be career harm. It could be integrity harm. So there are a lot of factors that go into the way you treat people and the impact that you have on the actions that you've taken as a result of unconscious bias, prejudice, or even discrimination. So what are some of the things that you can do to help mitigate some of that when you're thinking about recruiting, hiring, and retaining? First and foremost, and this is probably, I think, every single person on this call can identify with this statement that I'm about to make. When you see someone's name on a resume or on a document that you cannot pronounce, what do? You can write in the chat room, what do you do? Or what do you think? When you see someone's name on a resume or signature on a document that you cannot pronounce, what's your first thought, that first knee-jerk reaction thought? You can write in the chat box. While you're thinking about it, I'll give you my example. If it's an uncommon name, but it's a cultural name, the first thing I try to do is I try to pronounce it myself before I contact that person or before I try to say their name out loud in front of others. I try to pronounce it myself. If I'm on an interview, I will ask them, Devona, do you pronounce your name Devona, or is it Devona, or is it some other pronunciation? So I will be forthright in just asking, how do you pronounce your name? Because I think your name is beautiful. I just don't want to mess it up. So I put the onus back on me. If I'm reading a document with a person's signature, again, I will ask the question. So what's the first thing in your mind when you see someone's name that you can't pronounce? What do you think, or what do you do?
Here are some of the responses. Language barrier from Terrence. From Lynn, curious about the background and where they were educated. Another one from Bonnie, I really don't have an opinion of the person, but I do try to pronounce it and wouldn't hesitate to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Different experiences. And sometimes people just give up, right? They give up and they say, I'm not going to call this person in because I'm too embarrassed to say that I don't know how to pronounce their name. And then that becomes a barrier, unconscious barrier to actually hiring them into their job. Someone else says, Jamie says, I would ask how to pronounce and also what name they wish to be addressed by.
Exactly. So Robert or Rob, Jamie, that's a great response there. And even if we think about some cultural names, we may not know if it's a male or female. So even as Devona mentioned, some people just completely give up, but where others might say Mr. Williams or Mrs. Williams, not knowing if Devona is a man or a woman. And sometimes you can get it wrong even when the best intentions are there. So better to be safe than sorry, as some of us have said, just ask. There's nothing wrong with asking. You're not in the wrong, and you can't go wrong when that person actually pronounces their name for you. Then there's the other consideration. Their name could have history within the family. So you certainly don't want to disrespect the person if their name has deep-rooted history and meaning within their family. I use that as an example because it is certainly one that we can all resonate. But here's another example before we move on to the next slide. If you happen to be, let's say, in the elevator or in the grocery store or anywhere, and you find someone that wants to talk to you and they have dreadlocks, what's your first reaction? Do you wonder, are they naturally grown or are they done by their hairstylist? Do you wonder, is it cultural? Do you want them, because of your work environment, to pull their dreadlocks back? There was once upon a time where men were asked to shave their beard if they were in a corporate environment, to shave their beard or not come to work with dreadlocks, or for women with braids. But that's, a cultural preference. But it's also one that could lead to some unconscious biases or discriminatory factors. Devona.
Okay, I just wanted to add that we also have the issue of microaggressions, which just bringing that up just briefly. These are the little things that people do that are annoyances to people. There are small things, but they add up. And there are unconscious biases or stereotypes that people have and about people who are different than themselves. So this runs across the gamut from gender or disability or any difference that people might have, where they have some preconceived notion about that person. And micro inequities, and microaggressions, we're starting to see more and more documentation about this. So you can look it up on the internet and get some ideas of what they are. But there are little things like when people say, oh, good for you, meaning that, oh, I'm so surprised that someone like you could actually do this thing. And based on, you kind of know what they mean by that. So Sherm gives a great definition, and it says that microaggression is a modern form of racism, and that to reduce racism, we have to reduce microaggression. And these are the things that seem to be innocent, but it's when someone comes up and say you do have dreadlocks and someone comes up and they want to feel them. That's an example of microaggression. Hey, you just don't do that. So we're going to turn to ways to mitigate unconscious bias.
Yeah, and very quickly, just some really quick tips to mitigating unconscious bias. And these are things that we already know, but we need to put them into practice. So again, acknowledging and accepting your bias, reflecting on your personal preferences and thought processes, evaluating the diversity of your current workplace, focus on achievements more than cultural fit, bring in a diverse hiring team or affinity groups, consider having a chief diversity officer or diversity council. Design a standardized objective hiring process, and you can work with your HR teams if you have one to do this. Review and assess your first impression of some preconceived beliefs or thoughts that you might have. And always know what you really need before you build a diverse strategy and create a diverse workplace. Know what you need. Devona?
Okay. Well, we talked about human resources policies on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some of you said that you do have some in place, but you really haven't taken a look at them. And certainly many of you will need to update or consider updating your policies now that we're in a different place today. We're going through these movements that we've talked about. So the first thing that you do have to ensure that you do in your workplace is to have what I call a courageous discussion. And a courageous discussion means that you really have to be willing to ask the hard questions. And in many organizations, this is avoided because people don't want to have those uncomfortable conversations. And I have a long history of conducting diversity training sessions. And for many years, we always skirted around race because we didn't want to go there. In fact, I had clients that said, we don't want to talk about race. Make sure we don't talk about race. So diversity was everything except the big elephant in the room, which is racial bias that exists that we know is the core part of the problem. When you have these courageous discussions, you have to establish ground rules, create a safe place for people to be able to have these conversations. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we had the executive order that Erika talked about earlier. That's because we don't want to talk about it. Let's hope it all goes away. Let's just have an executive order. We won't have to talk about it. And that way, no one's uncomfortable. But to be uncomfortable means that's when we can really make the change happen. We can move from just talking about it to transformation. Next, we have to conduct a cultural audit. And a cultural audit means that you have to look across your organization and look at those images, symbols, communications materials, websites, icons that exist that might be offensive to a particular group or exclusive or create feelings of angst amongst some. And this can be expansive. So you may want to do this with a team. You might want to bring in an outside consultant to do it, but this is where you actually seriously look around. What kinds of things, are there sexist images that are around? Or do your communications materials meet the test of inclusion and fairness and equity? And then we want to develop the workplace values. We've talked about these pretty extensively, but if you don't have them, develop them. If you do have them, you'll need to upgrade them. Erika.
Yes, and you also need to develop and implement new and relevant workplace policies. If you do not have them in place right now, you can certainly work with your HR departments to develop those policies. You need to also train employees and management. Again, it is a full responsibility of all to not only acknowledge that there is the need, but also to have that credibility from the top down. So training employees and your management team is vitally important. Leaders must also walk the talk. So when we talk about that transparency and we talk about, cascading those importances down from the top, even as Michelle Taylor said in her board meetings and in her staff meetings, she's talking and walking exactly what we're talking about here. Another thing that I want to remind everyone of is all employers who are covered by non-discriminatory and EEO laws is required to post the, you'll receive, the posters that have to go in your workplace every year. Those notices must not only be posted in places that are visible to all employees, but it also helps to protect you as an organization, as a company, so that you are following federal guidelines. Providing training to employees is also, like I said, not only important, but it also helps you to remain educated. So these are some of the tips that we have in those policies for DE&I. And again, if your organization or your company doesn't have them, I'd start working with your HR team to identify what those policies should look like. I think we had some questions in the chat room, Devona.
We do. We have a question from Terrence that we didn't answer. How do we measure and hold employees accountable, in particular leaders? And then we also have a question about what examples do we have of policies, which we're actually going to cover on our next slide. So how do we hold employees accountable? Everyone has to be a part of understanding what the policies are, and it has to be accountable, tied to performance appraisal process.
And I think in light of being evaluated in their performance appraisals, I also think having pulse surveys. So if you want to keep management accountable, take those pulse surveys and include some of these questions in your pulse surveys.
Absolutely. So we're
management to take action.
I'm sorry, what was that, Erika?
I was saying that forces management to take action.
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to talk about just outline these 5 HR strategies to transition to diversity, equity, and inclusive workplace. And then we will move into a listing and discussion of policies that you might want to consider. Number 1, we want to conduct the cultural assessment. And we already talked about this briefly, but here we want to make sure that you have a means to actually start doing that and conducting it, do an assessment, do the visual images and so forth that we talked about. And then you want to be able to establish the workplace values and norms. We also thought that this slide is something that you could actually print out and post as a reminder for what you would do. And Erika.
Yes, and you also want to review recruitment, selection, and advancements, as well as your exit strategies. You want to develop, as we talked about before, policies and review them with employees, training them on them, and knowing HR laws. That's vitally important. And then you want to monitor, reward, and hold employees accountable. I think Terrence asked the question about accountability. Many want to look at performance appraisals as a process, as well as what we just mentioned, those pulse surveys to keep management accountable. Devona?
So here are some examples of what workplace policies you might consider. One, we've talked about value statements quite a bit, but you want to include those value statements, somehow reflect those in your policies. How will you hold people accountable for those? Your performance appraisals have to be job related. So the work that as you appraise performance, is it related to the job? And do you avoid subjective assessments? You want to look at your recruitment, selection, and promotion process and ensure that that also is unbiased. You may want to have a statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and an anti-discrimination policy, which is what some organizations are trying to do. You may also want to include a racial harassment policy, because by law, hostile work environments are also fall under Title VII. And so you might want to take a look at your racial harassment. A lot of times people don't understand what does racial harassment actually look like? And what are some examples? So this is part of your training, but you might want to have a statement that reflects that. And then lastly, you want to consider policies that address the subtle, more subjective forms of discrimination, such as those microaggressions that we talked about. And for some just brief examples, for example, when you have resumes and you're doing interviews, maybe one of the things you might want to do is to review resumes without the names. That would be an example. Or use behavioral-based interview process or a panel interview process when you're interviewing employees. You may want to look at appearance-based bias, such as hair standards or complexion requirements for wearing uniforms. I mean, this is actually something that I know it was said to me once upon a time, that certain people of certain colors don't look good in certain colors for presentations and so forth. Things like that you may want to look at and determine ultimately what policies you might consider adopting. And we included in our resources at the very end some different articles that you might want to take a look at to give you some ideas of where you would go. Anything to add, Erika?
No, I think you've covered it all. Great.
Okay. So, Erika.
Yes, and as we walk away from today, we want you to start building an action plan. So in your organization, since we don't have time to do it here on this session, we'd like you to share some of your comments and ideas with each other. You know, what do you wish that you could do in your organization? And how can we, Dr. Devona and myself, what can we do to help you build those action plans? And what would you like to hear more of? Because we certainly don't want this to be the last time we have these conversations, but we want to build on what we've learned and identified in today's session. So go back to your organizations and start thinking about building an action plan, especially if there's not one in place, but perhaps there is one in place and you want to enhance it, improve it, or build upon it. That's what Devona and I are here for, is to help you with those action plans.
Oops, and before we leave that slide, I do want to mention that within your action plan, you will also want to talk about what your success measures are, or metrics. What are some of the things that you would want to measure? And so as you monitor your progress, you want to be able to have milestones that you're looking for. So some things, for example, your retention. Do you want to look at your retention rate? Do you want to measure the number of incidents that you've had or claims that you've had? Do you want to measure successes, or do you have check-ins where you just check in with folks, or pulse, as Erika had said earlier, pulse check? How are we doing? Are we making progress in this area? And just have some lunch brown bags where you have those kinds of conversations. You can tell if people are not going along with your transition or your transformation if they disengage. So look and watch out for groups that are disengaging. But building an action plan, make it simple, simpler better. You know, don't try to do everything all at once. This is a process. It will take a while, and transformation takes a longer time. Transition is really the start of getting it going.
Mm-hmm.
So in the time that we have left, and I think we have about maybe 5 or 7 minutes for questions. Does anybody have any other questions that or comments that you would like to share?
And feel free to come off mute if you would like to, or if not, you can certainly share them in the chat room.
This is Sheila. I had a quick question. It's been I've been thinking about it a lot because of conversations I have with a lot of nonprofit leaders. But with a remote work environment, there's so many other variables that can influence access and equitable work experiences, and just wondered if that's emerging at all in some of the conversations that you've been having. Because before, everybody could be in the office and they could all have the same equipment and the same desks and access to the same supplies, but now all of this distributed work creates a lot of other variables, and just curious about what you're hearing in that area.
This is actually an area I did a workshop on this a couple of weeks ago on that very topic. And one of the questions that you have to ask your employees is, what do you need to be successful? This is a remote environment. What do you need to be successful? And help me understand what your personal situation is. So I may be in a situation where I have to care for a person, a relative who's sick with COVID, and I have small children at home that I have to homeschool. So my ability to meet certain meetings or work requirements may be on a different timetable, but you open up the dialogue so that people will understand what their situation is. You express empathy for it, and you allow them to be able to change the pace of their work requirement or have more flexibility. So it's being a flexible, adaptable workplace, which becomes a value statement, but also having those conversations, asking the questions, and then following through with actions that support that employee.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Devona, I see the message or question here from Catherine in the chat room. It's a great question in terms of training your staff and your leadership team. And I can tell you that with NAAAHR, we do quite a bit of training in the area of DE&I. And in fact, we add in their respect in the workplace, in the training. I'm sure Dr. Devona does these kind of trainings as well. Let's, we can certainly offer our help and support to you, whether conducting the training ourselves, or if you would like guidance on how to conduct that type of training. We are here to help you. And at the end of this, we will both share with everybody on the call our contact information. So Catherine, your question is a great one. And now is the time for, it's not even just training, but it's more, we take it from the approach of advisory council. So there's a concept of training, and the training has application behind it. Well, from the approach of advisory council, we can only take you but so far. If that application is not embedded in the DNA of your workplace environment, then it's not going to stick. Most adult learners will go through the training and walk away with a lot of great information, but the application is not relevant after the training is done. So what we do is we take the approach of being that advisory council for you, which builds more of a partnership and makes you accountable. So we will offer our contact information certainly here and available for anybody that needs assistance with, and I'll call it DE&I training.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I see we have a couple of, several different comments in the chat. One is, can we get a copy of the presentation? Yes, we'll make it available to everyone who participated today. Lynn asked, do we have a good survey that could share and evaluate unconscious bias? It's interesting, I used to use a great tool by Inscape, and then later the company changed hands a couple of times, Wiley, and now it's been discontinued. But there are a couple of newer surveys out in the marketplace, and we can get that information to you, Lynn.
Thank you.
And I think what's happening is now they are changing again. And I know my Spice of Life tool that I developed a few years ago, we sold out of it. We used it so much, we sold out of it, and it has to be updated because of all the changes that have happened in the last 3 to 5 years that have really made it out of date. So we're seeing that in the marketplace right now. But Lynn, how about we get the information to Sheila, and you'll have something to at least work with. So I think
thank you.
It looks like we have one minute left. Sheila, your closing comments? I know we need to wrap things up.
Well, this was really very helpful, and that's great. I was just going to ask, because you had mentioned a variety of resources, and I think that's so helpful for those who are participating today that can continue to explore this. really appreciate your wisdom and perspective, and thank you again for taking the time today. This is such an important topic, and I know that in the conversations I've had with nonprofit leaders, this is something they really care about, but they are also not sure about. So this topic today is very relevant, and again, appreciate your time and the resources that you've offered. Thank you.